We saw in a previous video that although Latin American countries held regular elections during the 19th century, these elections were almost never won by the opposition party. Instead, an opposition party's best bet for gaining power was to seize it through force. Partisan revolutions were by far the most common way that presidential power changed hands from one party to its rival in 19th century Latin America. A partisan revolution is a conflict where one party or a distinct faction of a party that is currently excluded from power attempts to seize national level power through force and become the new governing party, overthrowing and displacing the previous government in the process. In a few cases, the current governing party leaves power without a fight, and the partisan revolution looks more like a coup than a protracted struggle. But in most cases, the current governing party fights to hold on to power, and the revolutionary attempt leads to a civil war that is fought along party lines. This table shows the partisan revolutions fought between Colombia's liberal and conservative parties during the 19th century. And there are a couple things to note from this table. First, these partisan conflicts were a common occurrence. Most decades had at least one partisan revolution, and the 1850s had a revolution every couple of years. Second, only 3 of these revolutions resulted in a clear-cut victory for the opposition. In both cases, the governing party crushed the rebellion within a couple of years. Partisan revolutions did have much better odds of success compared to opposition electoral campaigns, but they were still a highly risky venture. Third, these conflicts were not always fought strictly between the conservative and liberal parties. In some cases, we see the conservative party teaming up with the more right-wing faction of the liberal party in order to defeat the more radical wing of the party. This table shows the partisan revolutions fought between the Colorado or Red Party and the Blanco or White Party in Uruguay. Although most of the partisan conflicts in Colombia had resulted in a decisive victory for one side, we see in Uruguay's case that many of the civil wars were fought to a draw. The opposition party failed to oust the governing party from power, but the governing party was also unable to force the opposition to demobilize. And in these cases, the parties were eventually forced to reach some negotiated settlement that tried to establish some sort of power-sharing arrangement. Partisan revolutions in other Latin American countries were not nearly as frequent as they were in Colombia and Uruguay, but every Spanish-speaking country had at least one significant partisan conflict during the 19th century, and most countries had much more than one. So why were these partisan conflicts so common in 19th century Latin America? On the demand side, opposition parties turned to revolution because they just did not have very good alternatives for contesting power through more peaceful means. There are 3 basic ways that opposition elites gain political power. First, they can use the constitutionally prescribed procedures such as elections. But as we discussed in the previous video, elections are extremely uncompetitive in 19th century Latin America. The governing party has a ton of institutional advantages that it can use to block any opposition electoral victory. So elections just are not a very realistic strategy for opposition elites that hope to gain power. Second, the opposition elites can try to cozy up to the current government in an attempt to join the governing coalition. Or they can demand some sort of power-sharing arrangement that allows both parties to participate in the government. Some parties in Latin America really do try to make power-sharing work, but all of these power-sharing arrangements eventually collapse. Part of the reason is that the parties are just too ideologically polarized in the middle of the 19th century. They have diametrically opposed political visions for their countries, and this makes it challenging for them to cooperate in any sort of bipartisan governing coalition. But I think an even more fundamental problem with elite power sharing was institutional rather than ideological. The 19th century Latin American presidency was all powerful and fundamentally indivisible. It does not matter how you distribute cabinet positions between parties. One party is always going to hold the presidency at any one point in time, and this gives that party the ability to renege on the power sharing arrangement whenever it chooses to do so. So, although Latin American elites are sometimes attempting to share power in order to avert a war, these power sharing arrangements are mostly a temporary solution at best during the mid 19th century. And this leaves the use of force as the main tool that is available to opposition elites who desire power. On the supply side, a second reason why partisan revolutions were so common was that they turned out to be relatively effective. On the one hand, it was pretty easy for the opposition party to field a large army. We saw in an earlier video that many Latin Americans who lived in rural areas were bound to landed elites through patron-client relationships. And one of the services that peasant clients were sometimes required to provide to their patron was military service in partisan militias. These patron-client relationships are one of the principal ways that Latin America's traditional parties are able to recruit the foot soldiers in their partisan conflicts. The partisan armies also rely on foreign mercenaries. There are various adventurers and soldiers of fortune who come over from the United States and Europe to participate in Latin America's partisan conflicts, such as the Italian patriot Giuseppe Garibaldi, who fought for the Uruguayan Colorado Party in the 1840s. In other cases, parties are also able to recruit veterans from neighboring Latin American countries that just wrapped up a partisan civil war of their own. And partisan civil wars easily spill over between countries when liberal or conservative parties in one country send aid and men in order to help their counterpart in a neighboring country seize power. Finally, some Latin American parties are also able to mobilize men into conflict on the basis of ideology as well. The religious cleavage that divided Latin America's conservative and liberal parties was an issue that a lot of non-elite citizens felt passionately about as well. For example, if you were an ardent Catholic and you see that the governing Liberal Party is enacting anti-clerical policies that are threatening the powers of the church, you might be willing to join a conservative revolution to overthrow the liberal government, even if you do not agree with everything else that the Conservative Party stands for. By the 19th century, we start to see traditional parties in Colombia and other countries develop broad bases of popular support. Ordinary, non-elite citizens start to see themselves as part of these parties. They identify with the parties on a psychological and emotional level, and elites are able to use these identities to mobilize ordinary people into partisan conflict. Another factor that helps make partisan revolutions viable during the mid-19th century is that Latin American states are still very weak at this time. Many countries have to contend with a geography that makes it difficult for the central government to control every part of their territory. Railroads exist in only a couple pockets of the region, and even road networks are still pretty underdeveloped. The central government just does not have very much authority over large swaths of its territory, and this gives opposition parties physical space that they can use to organize and launch a revolution. The state's coercive apparatus is also very weak. Most of the regular armies in Latin America are still quite small during the 19th century. This graph shows the size of the Colombian army, and perhaps not surprisingly, All three of the successful partisan revolutions occurred during the 1850s and 60s at a time when the regular Colombian army had fewer than 2,000 men. When the national army is this small, it is not too difficult for the opposition party to put together a militia large enough to defeat it in battle. Most of Latin America's 19th century partisan conflicts take the form of small skirmishes and guerrilla campaigns rather than large conventional battles. These revolutions are also primarily low-intensity conflicts that see relatively few casualties in battle. This table shows the most deadly partisan civil wars in each American country based on data from the Correlates of War project. Most of Latin America's bloodiest civil wars were a whole order of magnitude less deadly than the Civil War in the United States. The only partisan civil wars that surpassed the American Civil War in deaths per capita were the Federal War in Venezuela and the Thousand Days War in Colombia, where between 2 and 3% of the population died in battle. But even if the typical Latin American Civil War was significantly less deadly than that, the loss of life and economic destruction can really add up if your country is experiencing a conflict like this every couple of years. How then do Latin American countries escape this cycle of partisan conflict? In some countries in the region, the partisan conflict ends only after one of the parties defeats the other so decisively that it is permanently eliminated from the party system. It is not only thrown out of office, it is also decimated to such a degree that it is never able to stage a counter-revolution again. In a couple videos, we are going to see decisive victories like this occur in some of the countries in the northern part of Latin America. And this is going to lead to some pretty undesirable consequences for these countries' political systems. A second path out of partisan conflict was for the opposing parties to learn how to make power sharing work. By the end of the 19th century, elites in some countries are starting to get much better at sharing power, and some countries are going to stumble upon power sharing arrangements that do end up enduring for several decades. However, the most common reason why these partisan civil wars eventually end is because Latin American states finally become strong enough that the government can no longer be toppled by force. Many countries in Latin America embark on sustained state-building projects during the second half of the 19th century, and once this occurs, it becomes much more difficult for opposition parties to pull off a successful partisan revolution.